Hello, my name is Brian Dean, and as Patrice had said, and we are so excited to welcome you to a deeper dive into unlocking learner agency within the UDL Guidelines 3.0, and some strategies for honoring that and talking about that. We got about an hour to do that. So can you go to the next slide for me, Susan?
I will,
Susan's driving
Brian.
the
I'm just,
bus, by the way.
I just want to
Go
hop in and
ahead.
say that while Patrice is also putting it into the chat, you'll see on the screen a bit.ly
Yeah.
address to get you to the slides if you want to follow along. These will be sent to you with the recording, so you don't need to do this unless you want to do this now, but it's bit.ly. Brian, will you read it out? It's
Yeah, it's bit.ly backslash capital UDL, then lowercase agency, and then the number 24.
all right. Thank you.
Right on. Right on. Yeah, so anytime at any time in the chat box, please feel free to introduce yourself, ask questions, share ideas, a quote, hyperlink a resource for your colleagues, a cool picture that you may have, whatever cool travel plans you may have. If you have any discount coupons, your social security number, whatever you may want to put in there, you go ahead and throw it in the chat, and we'll have somebody monitoring the chat and bringing up those conversations or those questions as we go through the webinar. So please feel free to interact with us in the chat. And thank you. By the way, already in the chat, somebody said that I was stylish, and I appreciate that. But I have to tell you, it's because we are running the first ever UDL webinar that is also a Cardi party, folks. That's right. You're coming into fall, so we decided it was time to throw on some cardigans and get some apple cider and eat your favorite kind of donuts. And so, welcome to fall, and welcome to the Cardi party. If you folks have a cardigan on right now, if you're a teacher and you exist in one of those really cold rooms, throw it on, and you're part of the Cardi club. Maybe we'll do that every Thursday. I don't know. We'll just do it in spirit. All right. So if you don't know how to use the chat box, you go into your side in Zoom, you click under chat, and then you go to the side and make sure that you have it set up so that all panelists and attendees can see what you're typing in there. Unless it's a severe criticism of me or Susan, then you just go ahead and send that to just send it to me personally, and I'll be happy to take care of it. I'll probably lose it. You hit me with the next one, please. Yes. So at CAST, as always, there'll be some things in this webinar that you will recognize, and then some things we're going to take a little off road. But one of the big things that we are committed to in CAST, if this is your first webinar or if you've been with us in the past, is our accessibility and creating access and accessibility in everything that we do. So these are the commitments that we put forward to you in today's webinar. So we've taken our to ensure that this deck is accessible, and you have a link to that deck in the chat. We'll put it up again. But we used a tool to perform an automated check. So we used Microsoft's Office Accessibility Checker, and we also checked manually to ensure a clear reading order for screen reader use. And we provided access to the deck to you. Again, it's that bit.ly, and that means you can personalize your experience as we speak. So if you just want to mute us out and read through it, it's going to be harder to follow along, but we want to give you that option. Or if you just want to see it in full screen and that's easier, that's cool too. Also, always at CAST mission. And so I'm going to read it word for word, right? So, and then I'm going to come back at it. So CAST leads, inspires, and convenes a global community to design equitable, inclusive learning experiences through our universal design for learning network. And what that really means to me is that we're committed to doing the hard work and the good work of making sure that every student has access and feels that they can engage in brilliantly designed learning environments and learning opportunities.
And I can hop
And
into
you,
that, Brian, if you want
yeah,
me
if you
to.
want to,
Yeah, sure.
I don't want to take the whole mic, but you go ahead.
Well, no, I want to tell you that I don't know if it's just me and maybe it's in the chat, but there's a little bit of an audio garble as you're presenting. So just give you that.
Okay.
Well, I'll take this definition and then I'll pass it right
Yeah.
back to you. So Universal Design for Learning, we call it UDL, as many of you know, but if you're here for the first time, a special welcome to you, is an educational framework based on research in the learning sciences that guides the development of flexible and accessible methods, materials, and environments that embrace variability, minimize barriers, and develop learner agency for all. And this hour today is really going to flush out and expand on that word learner agency. Like, what do we really mean by that? What does that look like? And we hope that you'll be thinking about that in your context. All right, Brian, back to you.
All right, is that better now?
A little bit.
No,
Let's see.
nothing.
Introduce yourself and we'll give you
Okay.
an assessment.
All right. Okay. So I am Brian Dean, and I am CAST UDL Innovation Specialist, which means I get to sit around with cool people like Susan and our special guest and other folks at CAST and think up really cool solutions to really unique and hairy problems. So I've been doing that for a while, and I've been in education for over 20 years, and most of that time was spent in juvenile corrections, teaching in juvenile corrections. I mean, we don't have a long enough webinar to get into if I was in juvenile corrections, but teaching in juvenile corrections and residential facilities for individuals with mental health issues. And I'm gonna pass it to Susan.
Great. And your audio is a little better, but not totally. So just FYI, we can live with it for sure. I'm Susan Shapiro. I come to CAST from university life, where I worked and ran a graduate program for teachers. And then before that, a lot of consultation around inclusive education. And I was a public school teacher in my earliest days. And this is where we get to announce our special guest, but it's kind of not that surprising anymore, is it, Brian? Because here she comes.
Bring her in. Hey, okay. I'm gonna
I mean,
I'm gonna shoot it first, Kelly, and I'm gonna say, "Hey, friend," because that's how Kelly opens up everything, and I absolutely love it. Hey, friend.
hey friends, I'm here for the Cardi party. Although I saw someone in the chat say they're having a jorts party, and I think we should do the jorts and the cardigan, friends. What do you think?
Jort Jamboree is on the way.
Perfect.
Jort
Oh my
Jamboree is
goodness.
on the way.
Love it. So I'm so excited to be here. So I'm Kelly Suding. I'm on the accessibility team at CAST. And so I've been in the field for a very long time. I started off as a paraprofessional, then I became an educator, and I was in general education and also taught students who had more complex needs, more intensive supports, and I loved everything about that. And then my specialty areas of support for state agency before I came to CAST was learning disabilities, autism, and then all things accessibility. So that comes with our materials, our technologies, universal design for learning, really ensuring the access for all learners. So I'm here to support, and I'm really excited to be here.
Great. And we're really glad you're
Right.
here.
I'm ready to go. I'm ready to go as well. I'm hatted, tatted, and ready to get at it, so to speak. So what do you think, Susan? Let's jump into this first opening reflection.
Yeah, there's an image on the screen of the globe, of the world, and that's because part of our mission at CAST is to convene conversations about learning and learners and barriers and design. And so while we are here to hopefully do a little bit of teaching, we really are emphasizing the party in our Cardi party, right? We're bringing you together to ask you to help us think about, what does learner agency look like? Some of you know the older version of the UDL guidelines used the term expert learning. We're not going to spend too much time thinking about that today, but you'll notice in the updated, expanded edition, Guidelines 3.0, there is this emphasis. In fact, it's the goal of UDL, learner agency. So take a moment, maybe solo reflect, or turn to people if you're near other people. If you're in a coffee shop, turn to strangers. Take some notes or put it in the chat box in our Zoom if you want to. What does learner agency look like in your context? We'll just pause for a minute so people can have a little bit of reflection time.
And I'm just going to say this, Susan. If you are in a coffee house or coffee shop and you do decide to turn to a total stranger, please let us know how that went. And if you need any assistance, like if it, we'll be happy to help you out there.
That's right. Get their name, and we'll give them a shout out, all the things.
Yeah, all
You
the
send them
things.
the link to the slides. Yeah.
Why not? Why not? It's a free webinar. Let them join.
We're going to ask you a question at the end of this hour, which is, what have you thought about that might make you think differently, or something you want to change or shift in your context related to learner agency? So you'll have a chance to revisit that or turn to that person and tell them. The goals for this webinar are really for you just to understand something that you probably understand now, but maybe a little bit more deeply, that UDL is all about designing so students have access. But sometimes we stop there, right? And that's a great place to be focused on access. But we also are thinking about agency, not giving learners agency with their graduation diplomas, but honoring the agency they walk in with on day one. We want to give you an opportunity in this hour to reflect on how the agency of learners in your context is honored and built, and also how you might need to make a small shift, maybe a redesign to better honor and build that learner agency. There's an image on the
I got to
screen.
be honest with you.
Yeah,
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
no,
You
something
go.
about
You
that.
go next. I will tell you this. I'm looking through the chat, and I got to tell you, I think folks have a beginning handle on this learner agency gig. We're getting some really great stuff coming in, like learners, regardless of age, are the owners of their learning from Robin. We've got some other good ones that are coming through. Learners having skills, motivation, and cognition to be able to learn whatever they want, to learn no matter what the context they are in. I mean, I'm primed. I'm ready to go. So go
That's
ahead.
right.
Go ahead
And
with
bringing one's authentic self to the learning space. How fabulous is that? Hug yourself. That's amazing.
Yeah, that's a good one. That's a t-shirt right there.
Fantastic. We're so glad you're all here. And if you're watching this as a recording, we're just as glad that you are here too. And we would always welcome, hearing from you at CAST as you're thinking about designs. So the image on the screen is the center of a sunflower, and it shows what will become the seeds. And we just want to plant some seeds here in this hour. So we want to define learner agency, then really just think about some big ideas related to it. One is that UDL honors and builds agency. That's the relevance of universal design for learning, really honoring and building that learner agency. We want to make sure that we emphasize there are no prerequisites to agency. You don't have to prove that you're ready for agency. You're born with agency as a human being. We'll look at learning across the lifespan. We'll have some time thinking about inclusive technologies that don't just build access to learning, they also give learners who use them agency. We'll talk a little bit, and Brian will really lead us off here, thinking about the responsibility that comes with agency. You'll hear Brian use a term called bounded autonomy, just as a little bit of an appetizer. And then we'll end thinking a little bit about agency beyond students. What agency do teachers have and need, right? Where is agency of administrators honored and built in learning systems? So again, we're really glad you're here. We're going to start off by just defining learner agency. And if you go to our udlguidelines.cast.org, and somebody will put that in the chat, you'll be able to see a lot of information about all of the guidelines. And there's some information about agency there. And this is the language that we use. We pulled from our own website to say that learner agency is simply the capacity to actively participate in making choices in service of learning goals. Agency is the goal of UDL. We sometimes hear people talking about, especially school leaders, well-intended, but to say, I've got to get every teacher to use UDL. But UDL is not the goal, right? Access and agency are the goal. UDL helps us to build access and agency, but using UDL is not the goal. And we define learner agency as three things. It's purposeful and reflective, it's resourceful and authentic, and it's strategic and action-oriented. There's an image on the screen of a young child stacking cans, like soup cans from a pantry. Learners have agency at all ages. Young learners have plans. They're acting in ways that are personally and socially meaningful. There's purpose in this learning. The image on the screen is a woman on the face of a rock. She's rock climbing and she's making decisions, right? She's reflecting on the next right move. Learner agency is reflective. It's self-awareness and metacognition to identify internal and external influences that support learning and making adjustments when necessary. Learner agency is resourceful. There's a young woman looking at a laptop studying. understanding and applying assets, strengths, resources, and linguistic and cultural capital. Learner agency is authentic, learners talking together, laughing, making meaning, increasing comprehension, and deepening understanding in ways that are genuine. Learner agency is strategic, looking at a skateboard park and making decisions, setting goals, monitoring learning intentionality and planfulness. And learner agency is action oriented. Even our youngest learners, like picking themselves up and learning to crawl, right? Having a goal of getting to the other side of the room, self-directed collective action in the pursuit of learning goals. And I love this little toddler's face. Like, no one had to give me this agency, right? I was born with it.
I think that's a really key thing that we need to keep bringing up is that it's just like breathing, right? Like you were born doing it. You were born with agency, and just like learning, you were born learning. The idea that we are going to give this, right? Like we're going to give you learner agency, or we're going to give you learning or be in control of those things is really kind of a myth and a perception that we put forward. It's a perception of giving those things, or a perception of authority. And actually, in reality, it's not really something that we can actually, actualize. And so it's the idea more of how do you build learning environments and learning opportunities that foster those things and let learners of any age, of any type, be able to explore and find their way through that, right? And struggle with it, because that's a huge part of it, is struggling with it and have rights, have rights to it, but also have responsibility to their community as they do so.
I love that you said that, Brian, because everyone should have the dignity of risk, right? And I think UDL really opens the door for our students to be able to take those risks because it's a safe, inclusive design that is honoring that power that that we'll be alluding to this whole hour.
And I love that you use the word power, right? Sometimes I feel like we're afraid of using that word in schools, but it's all
Yeah.
about it, right? Schools are all about power and who has it and how they use it and the feedback we give people about power. So thank you both. And thank you all in the chat. So much is happening there. I feel like we could just turn off our cameras and read the chat. So UDL helps us to build agency. It's a framework that guides the design of learning environments that are accessible, inclusive, equitable, and challenging for every learner. The goal is to support learner agency, that capacity to actively participate in making what we like to call learning decisions. I remember I was a long time ago a first grade teacher, and although I didn't know about UDL 37 years ago, I did used to call my class to the rug, right, and say, come over, we're going to be making a decision, right? How do you want to hear the story, right? Giving learners that opportunity to decide. One of my colleagues and friends, Michael McSheehan, heard me ramble one time many years ago about UDL, and he said, okay, Susan, stop, I get it, I get it. You're just saying this. UDL is about design readiness, not learner readiness. Instead of asking if the learner is ready for the lesson, UDL asks if the lesson ready for the learner, right? Does this lesson have the flexibility and sort of the infrastructure for learners to make decisions, to have the dignity of risk, the dignity of success, the dignity of decision making? And the guidelines are on the screen just to remind us all of the big picture of the UDL guidelines. And I'm just going to quickly sort of show you where agency lives, and then we're going to get into some of the kind of the thinking here. So the goal of UDL is learner agency. Learning is a survival skill. We know that all learners will have jobs that don't exist, and technologies that don't exist will be part of those jobs. So we want to make sure that we're building the agency of learners. We know from cognitive science that people vary in how they learn, and so we have to address that variability in our designs, and we have to honor people's ability to make decisions about how they're going to engage, which representation of the content they might use, and how they want to act, communicate, navigate, and express their learning. We do this by designing multiple means. And I'll
Real
just
quick, can I just
jump in.
highlight
Yeah, yeah.
a piece, Susan? So I want to jump back to the chat real quick. Katie Wise, shout out to Wyatt. It left a great comment that said, "Who holds the power in the classroom?" Right, and then said Andrew Tisha vibes. Shout out to Andrew Tisha. But that, I mean, that's truly it. Like, who holds the power within a classroom? And let's be honest, it is a perception of power that we have absolute control in there, right? Because what are you going to do if 30 first graders decide to revolt in your classroom? You'll find out real quick how much power you really have, right? In trying to contain that situation, right? So it's really this perception of power, and really UDL starts to ask us, how do we share that perception of power? Because if we always, in traditionally, what we have done in our traditional kind of like Prussian, system of methodical education, is we've tried to take that power away or supplant that power, or assert authoritarian power over that. And really what ends up happening is we leave students without agency. We leave students, when they leave our compensatory K-12, without any kind of residuals of education, or any, where they're a global learner, they're great, they're a good citizen, they're collaborative, they're all these pieces that also add into agency. They leave and they don't have those skills, because we have said this is how we do things, and it's easier to manage this way as opposed to build community this way.
That's right. And I think sometimes we get stuck in if our student's going to comply and submit, right? And I think giving the students that power will just kind of alleviate
Sure.
that struggle that we have as educators, feeling like we have the power. But I mean, yeah, I'm getting ready to get on my soapbox, friends. So
I know, I got mine right
keep
next
carrying
to
on.
me. Right? Because it is that idea. Do you want a classroom of ritual compliance, or do you want a classroom of engagement? And you'll never have a classroom where 100% of your students are engaged, and that's okay. And we need to know that, accept that, realize that, and be okay with that. But you will have points where you will have majority of your students engaged, and then they will disengage and re-engage. We'll talk about that. But the fact of the matter is, like, that's what builds their community, right? Ritual compliance is, I do this because I've gone through 10 years of this, or 6 years of this, or 4 years of this. And I've learned how to give you what you want, instead of sit at the table and eat what I want to eat.
Yeah. And Allison put, but teachers do have power too.
Oh
You're
yeah,
not
for
wrong.
sure.
That's
No,
right.
it's not wrong for teachers to have power. We want them to have power, right? It's the concept of, like, how do we start being more transparent about that, and saying these are the things that I have control, and I have to control, or I have to manage, right? Because I have to manage the environment for safety, or whatever it may be. And what power do I have there, and what power can I truly give to students and share with them and scaffold them into, right? It's not just like, just turn the floodgates open and be like, yo, do what you feel, right? Like, that's not learning either, and that's not actually agency at all, right? That's chaos is what that ends up being, especially if we don't have the scaffold and the analytical roadmaps to think about those things.
Yeah. I want to hop in and say two things. One is, I don't know, Andretisha, if you're here, but there is a slide that is a quotation from you, because I think Andretisha was the first person who used the word honor when we were talking about agency. And I really just, my whole world changed when that word was used, honoring learner agency. I also want to say that if you're looking at the screen right now and you're seeing design multiple means of engagement, and it looks like a UDL intro webinar. The reason that we want to just build this context is for those of you that may be less familiar with UDL. And when we talk about UDL builds agency, like, what are we really talking about? So I'll just say quickly that because of variability in learning, we want to honor that and give learners options. We design these multiple ways for learners to engage. We design multiple ways for them to make meaning of content. Brian, do you want to hop in here and talk about the engagement, re-engagement, or should we move ahead?
No, I think we can hit it real
Great.
quick.
I didn't know if you went away. I was afraid you were gone.
No,
I was
I'm
trying
not
to be
gone.
cool
Although
about that.
my Zoom keeps kind of quitting, so you might see me on and off of camera. So
That's okay.
but so as a teacher myself, I really became confused, because I would plan a lesson, and I thought it was a dope lesson. I thought it was really great. I had a great engagement hook. Like, I was like, they're gonna be on the edge of their seat. But I made the mistake of thinking that that point of engagement, that whatever it may be, that natural phenomenon, that question that you're asking, that essential question, whatever it may be, that point of engagement, I made the mistake of thinking that that's going to carry a student through an entire learning task. And the fact of the matter is, it won't. In fact, I'd be willing to, how many folks out there in the audience, or if we're willing to admit it ourselves, have been in a professional learning for a full day, right? And you have disengaged, right? There are times that you will, right? And that's okay. But we are, as educators, we are so often very afraid of our students becoming disengaged. So then how do you bring them back? Well, you create opportunities of re-engagement. And that's when I started to realize that re-engaging, right? That process of re-engaging is actually the powerful part of learning, right? Because now I have to make meaning. I have to look at what I'm learning. I have to synthesize it. I have to understand it, and then I have to re-engage in the word, right? And then I am doing that at my pace, right? So when I'm running a PL with adults, what do I tell them? I tell them the same thing I'll tell you folks in this webinar. Look, you work very hard. If you need to disengage to answer an email, or you need to disengage because guess what? You need to buy yourself a great new pair of shoes on Amazon, or to plan yourself a trip because you deserve one, go ahead.
Or a
Nobody can take that
cardigan.
freedom from you. Yeah, if you want to join the Cardi party and you found a really dope one on Amazon you want to find, go ahead, right? Because the fact of the matter is I don't have control of that, first of all. And second of all, the more that when you come back to us, be present with us. And when you do that, we're focusing intentionality and we're actually wrapping our engagement and our motivation around the learning task. And that's what supports us and supports learners through the tasks that they are, right? Making personal connections. And we do that in andragogy, right? The study of how adults learn. We do that in andragogy naturally in a lot of ways, but in a lot of ways it's because of the ritual that we've gone through of being disengaged. So I think that the re-engagement principle is just as important to build those on-ramps to re-engagement, those opportunities to re-engagement, as it is to build that hook, that really cool thing, activity, whatever it is that we get them started with. It's important to bring them back and allow them to find their way back. And as they progress through your classroom, not just their learning career, but through your classroom, they will become, student learners will become more used to re-engaging and finding that and being okay with disengaging, because your brain needs a break sometimes.
That's right. I used to think that engaging my students was me doing everything, hands-on support, reading everything to them when my design was barrier. I felt
The
like I
team
was being
beat,
useful
right?
and I was helping them be engaged. I learned my lesson, friends, and I share this story all the time. Reading directions to this test for my student, I talked for like 10 minutes. You know, he didn't have access to the technologies he needed. Once I was done talking, he looks at me and he said, "Are you growing a mustache?" He became disengaged. I became engaged at the spa, but that was the thing. I
Yeah.
thought I was engaged in helping him facilitate him, but I was the barrier. I was the barrier in that.
Oh, and so yeah, so this is this is a quick equation for agency and motivation, and it's been around.
Oh, looks like we lost you there, Brian, so value multiplied by expectations over delay multiplied by impulsivity. And when Brian comes back on, we'll ask him to expand on that. Brian, are you there? Okay. I'm going to jump ahead for time's sake, and when we will pop back to slide 28 and 29 when Brian pops back on, if we can get there.
If anyone would like to screenshot Brian's still face right now and tweet it out, that would be amazing. That would be amazing. Thanks in advance, friends.
And so just again, for the context, UDL gives learners options for how they engage, options for which representation of the content they use, and options for how they act and express their learning. And Brian, I'm going to jump back so you can just explain, you froze for a little bit there, this equation, and then there's a little bit of the glossary afterwards. Well, it looks like maybe you're frozen again, so. But you know what I love about this webinar is that I know that Brian's voice is a little garbled, but we're all leaning in because it's worth it, right? Like there's so much great. And I think sometimes, about all the ways that learners communicate with us. And sometimes when we, they're not raising their hand right away and saying the thing in full sentences, like, are we leaning in like this, right? So, why don't we all just always lean in like we're leaning in for Brian? Okay. In the new guidelines, there are still little gray tabs along the left-hand side. The titles of those tabs have shifted a little bit, and I just want to call them out as a little bit of guideposts for building agency. So that top horizontal row, we can be thinking about how we're building access that really affords learners agency. That middle row, really thinking about how we're supporting the learning process so that learners can continue to use their agency to navigate learning. And the bottom horizontal row, how learners, we're really supporting that executive function, supporting learners so they can use all of that juicy cognition for the goal and not on like, what am I supposed to do? Where do I put this? And those executive function supports. So UDL is a framework, and if you know a lot about it, you know this, and if you don't, we invite you to some of our other offerings to learn more about it. In fact, I'm teaching a 2-day offering right now. I just kind of ran away from that to come here. Because UDL is a great framework if you believe in learner agency for designing instruction that really helps you to design so that learners can use their agency. There are no prerequisites to agency. There's nothing that you have to be able to do or prove. We don't give learners power, we honor and build the power that they have. This is a quotation from Andretisha Fitzgerald, excuse me. And I'm just going to move these Zoom boxes. Or Kelly, can you see the whole thing? Would you mind reading it for us? I've got too many windows open.
Oh yeah, honoring learner agency. Yeah. As educators, we honor them. We learn alongside them about their strengths, their areas of giftedness, their goals, their destination, and their definition of success. Without it, we disrespect their path to success based on what we think about them without the honor of knowing for sure that we are preparing them by equipping them to learn beyond barriers.
Thank you. And I just love that we disrespect their path, right? Where are we disrespecting their path?
Sorry, can everybody hear me again? Am I back
Yes.
on?
You're back.
Okay, did you guys wrap it up? Are you guys all done? It was a good webinar.
Yeah, it was really
Fine.
good. Yeah. Yeah,
Good.
Kelly
I'm
was
glad to
asking
hear it. I'm
people
glad to
to,
hear it. Can we
Kelly's
talk about
asking
some of
people,
those participants? Can we talk about some of those participants in the chat? Oh my God. No, I'm just kidding. I'm so sorry that my internet keeps dropping me out.
it's okay. We were just talking about how it's worth it. It's worth it because of the things that you're saying. So thank you for being here. And thanks everybody for your persistence. If you've heard me talk about UDL or anything with learning before, you've heard this story, but I promised I would share it for the rest of my life. So I'm just going to share it again because it really, I think, has relevance here when we think about agency. So a long, long time ago, I was a student teacher in Belgium. I was at the International School of Brussels teaching 3rd grade. I had my like special ed, elementary ed, dual certification thing going. I was in my final year of college, and the headmaster asked me if I would fill in for a paraprofessional to work with a young woman, 9th grader named Tina, who had cerebral palsy, and she was being mainstreamed into the high school art class. That was the only general education class that she visited during the week. They didn't want her to miss it. Of course, I said yes. I was a student teacher. You say yes to everything. And I walked into the class. They were doing an art activity where they were trying to notice like light and shadows and such. And they tore a magazine ad image in half and then used colored pencils to fill in the other half. My first thought with my special education hat on, unfortunately, I mean, I believe in special education, it's connected to civil rights, but in the way that I was learning about special education, it was more about like building students' weaknesses. I thought, well, Tina can't do that. So I got her some of that really big chart paper and some of those really thick crayons. And I said, why don't you color? I walked away, talked to other students. That was the only thing I did correctly in that moment. I came back, she had made some marks on the page. And then I set what I hope is the lowest high expectation I will ever set for any learner, anywhere, anytime. And I said, I love all the colors on the page. Why don't you make a rainbow? And she did, she kind of, in a shaky way, she moved her arm. And throughout all of this, Tina and I had no conversation. I really had no confirmation that Tina was understanding me or listening to me even. But I did notice that she was starting to make a rainbow. When I came back, I saw on her page, she had written, I am bored. She had capitalized, underlined the most important word in the sentence, punctuated. And I did 2 things. First, I apologized. And I don't think we do that often enough as educators. And the second thing was I asked for her paper. And I said, can I please have this so I can tell this story and teach this story for the rest of my life? To remind myself and every educator that I come into contact with. And at that time, I didn't know I'd be here with all of you. The importance of presuming competence, of not waiting for learners who don't rely fully on speech to prove something about their intelligence before we honor something about their agency. Learners don't need to prove competence in the eyes of the educational system. Learners have the right to use their agency to make decisions as learners. So we want to really call out that learners with complex support needs are part of this conversation. Brian and I were also talking about his experiences working with students who may have been involved with the juvenile system, and how often those students, right, although very different in many ways from Tina and other students who may have more developmental disabilities, how they too were often denied access to their own agency, right, kind of cut off from their own power. If you know this book, Reclaiming Youth at Risk by Brent Hope Brokenleg and Ben Bachern, it's beautiful. They have a simple model called the Circle of Courage. And I used to do a lot of inclusive education consulting, and I ran around with this behavior specialist who, at 21-person meetings, would listen to everybody say, we need a behavior plan and a motivation plan and a punishment plan for Jack. And she would put this circle of courage on the table and say, tell me a little bit about where Jack can be generous. And tell me a little bit about where in Jack's life he has the opportunity to be independent. And where in Jack's life does he have that sense of mastery? Like he can really do this. And where in Jack's life does feel a sense of belonging? Like it doesn't matter what his hair looks like, right? He just has that sense of belonging. And oftentimes, the answer was not so many places. And so she would say, well, let's build the life, right? Because often behavior is an unmet need, right? Often behavior is a communication to us about something that needs to change. Brian, I know that you love this work too. Do you want to jump in?
I do. Well, I mean, if we look at behavior, right, like there's a couple things about behavior, just broadly, right? Behavior is usually an act to get something or to avoid something. And behavior is actually the outcome of a feeling, right? And underneath that feeling is a need, right? And if we are just spending time addressing the behavior, we're never going to fill that need. So we will always be chasing that behavior, right? And we'll only be addressing and putting out the fire of that behavior instead of addressing the need and the feeling that are kind of underneath or the result, have the resulting behavior. And so to me, one of the largest things about working in juvenile corrections, when I came to UDL, I did not come to UDL because I needed to raise the literacy rates or the numeracy rates of my students. I came to UDL because I would have students come in that might be with me for 3 weeks, or they might be with me for 3 months, or they might be with me for 3 years, depending on what their sentence was, or depending on what, how long they were in the treatment facility. And I knew that those students were going to go back to the place that they came from, and especially in juvenile corrections, that meant that they were one of two things. They were going to either end up dead, or they're going to end up getting picked up, and I'd either see them again, or if they were age of consent, they'd be gone, right? And so for me, UDL, when I saw it, was a way to articulate and put into action and put into my classroom a way to help my students realize that even though they were in lockup, even though they had committed crimes, they still could be selfish with their education, and they still could have agency around making choices about what do I want to do with my life. But the issue was they didn't have the scaffolding to get there, right? They just it just had never happened for them, or nobody had taken them aside, or they hadn't been in a place where they could have structured choice or bounded autonomy in moving that forward. And they had very little motivation. And I know that I dropped out when we talked about the motivation equation, but that motivation leads to agency in many ways. And those two things travel together. And so when you look at that, if we have time, we'll go back to that equation. But when you look at that equation is really about, can I expect to be successful? And do I value what I'm doing and value the success that I may have in it? And that's all undercut by the impulsivity, right, of getting it done, right, and the delay in seeing my success, right? And so so for motivation, if we shorten that delay in success, so scaffold, small successes that lead to larger ones, we can raise motivation, and then we can raise agency. If they can see if learners can see value in what they do, then they can learn, then they begin to see that I can do this. I have the expectancy of completion and success, and I also have value in what I'm doing because it's moving me along, right? So I think this circle of courage, that motivation factor, those things are great for students that, for a long time, we've still called those students emotionally disturbed in some states. We call those students emotionally impaired in some states, behaviorally disturbed in some states. And really, it's about emotional dysregulation. And I would dare say for our folks that don't necessarily teach in those realms, I dare say that you see some students with behavioral dysregulation happening more and more.
Mhm.
So anyways.
Yeah, and sometimes I can even be from an unidentified learning disability, right? Like I always say it's easier for a student, to punch their friend in math class than to say, I can't read the directions to this math test, right? So then what we're seeing are these behaviors and then these labels kind of go on. Susan, thanks so much for sharing your story about Tina. And I don't know if this is going to throw you off or not, but it reminds me of something Paula Cluse said. And I was wondering if you could share that.
What did she
As a
say?
keynote about inclusion. I'm putting you on the spot.
Oh, about the vegetarian thing
Yeah, just about like we're
during
spending
her
all
keynote.
this time to figure out how we can have our students be in class for 20 minutes when in fact,
The real question is, why did she ever have to leave? Right?
yeah,
Yeah. Paula did our keynote at the first International UDL Con that was held in Sacramento and online this summer. And we were so honored to have her there. And she ended, and I thought you were referencing this, Kelly. She said something about, it's not like vegetarianism, like, oh, our school is including kids. Oh, is your school into that? Right? Like, are you guys thinking about being vegetarian? No, we have a federal law. We have 40 years of research, right? And we have UDL, she said, right? And we know how to do this. So yeah, we need to stop asking the question, like, how can we kind of find 20 minutes where maybe this kid could be in a reading group to how can we stop asking the question of when she can join? Why don't we start realizing that she never needs to leave, or asking why would she ever need to leave? So Kelly,
yes.
we
And
know that agency has a lot to do with technology too for some of us. And
that's right.
that's one of the reasons we invited you to this party and your great cardigan. So I'll drive the slides for you. You can just give me a beep when you want me to change.
Yeah, perfect. So yeah, accessibility in our materials and technologies definitely supports learner agency for sure. So when we talk about accessibility, one of our colleagues at CAST says that you can have accessibility without UDL, but you can't have UDL without accessibility. And I think that we should always remember that. And it's really outlined in the 3.0 guidelines as well, specifically talking about materials and technologies. So when we talk about accessibility when it comes to our content for our students to be able to show what they know, right? Digital does not mean it's accessible. It just means it's available. So thinking of our content, we may be giving all our students all of these, digital materials, but if they can't use their screen reader or use text to speech in order to gain that knowledge, they're never going to be able to show you what they know, because lack of knowledge does not mean lack of intelligence. So if we don't have our content designed with accessibility in mind, it's our students are constantly going, that's going to be the barrier in our design. So the definition of accessibility from the Office of Civil Rights is this: it's a person with a disability can inquire the same information, engage in the same interactions, enjoy the same services in an equally effective, equally integrated manner with substantially equivalent ease of use as a person without a disability. So these are not just extra steps that we're doing for our students that we're providing and designing. It's just steps that we've missed, right? And so moving on to that next slide, within the guidelines, I talked about that. I just want to show you where that's at in designing multiple means of action and expression. Optimize access to accessible materials and assistive and accessible technologies and tools. This is a game changer for our students. I worked with, we'll move on to the next one, then I'll share a little bit about that student. So when we talk about honoring honoring student power, we're looking at those components. So universal design for learning, that's the choice designed into the environment. And then AIM, or accessible educational materials, it's the same content in an accessible format. So when I say AIM, that's the information that our students are getting. That's the content, that's the materials. And we're prepared to have it in Braille, large print, graphic, tactile, whatever is needed, whatever the students' preferences are, we're ready for that because we've thought about accessibility. And then with the use of accessible and assistive technologies, that's just differing ways of accessing, interacting, and responding to that same content. the same content. So if our students can comprehend it, like a junior in high school who's beginning reading levels first grade, if their comprehension level, friends, is at grade level, they should have access to grade level curriculum. And that's where accessibility comes into play. And that's where UDL designing our environment from all aspects, including the content that we're giving our students. So the components of access, friends, we have on the next slide, we have our materials. So they all have to work together. We have universal design for learning, like we just talked about. They all have to work together for true access. So our materials must be accessible. Our technology must work with those materials. Again, if we're just scanning worksheets and it's just an image, our students can't use that technology to gain that knowledge. And then the assistive technology, that's, our students need that. It's essential for them to access the content. So all of those things have to work together for true access. So on the next slide, this is a GIF accessing from start to finish. And it's essentially, you push the accessible door, it opens up and it gets to stairs, okay? So we're thinking of UDL. We feel like we've got everything designed, but then our content's not accessible. We've got them in the room, but now how are they going to get upstairs? How are they going to access that content? So we have true accessibility from start to finish. We're looking at universal design for learning, making sure our content and accessibility is all into play. So we can support you in all of that. We do have a tip sheet on the next slide, just some tips on how to create your materials accessible, but reach out to us for support. So we have that tip sheet that is available for you. It's accessible for you. And then we also have a video that's from our sister center, the CITES, the Center on Inclusive Technology and Educational System. And this is a great breakdown. I gave you a really brief view about AIM and assistive and accessible technologies, and this really lines it out in 6 minutes. So it's a great resource for you to have moving forward.
Kelly, my mom, I just called the YMCA in my town because my mother, who has lots of physical limitations based on age and some muscular stuff, the only place she can move is in the water. And she's been trying to find the swimming pool to go to. But often, all these places that we've been checking out, the pool is great, but the doors to get to the pool or the slippery, wet floor to use with her walker, she can't get from A to B, right? So that
Yeah.
idea that accessibility is not just this little spot in the space, right? It is all of the space and the full navigation of it. Thank you so much. I don't know that we all think about technology the minute we think, some of us probably do think about technology and we think about agency, but as a teacher, right? I may think about, I really want to empower my learners. Maybe I need to be thinking about, those inclusive technologies that are just predictable options in my class for every learner. I remember in my early days of consultation in inclusive schools, it was only kids who had like an IEP who could use, text to speech or speech to text software. And now it's like, oh my gosh, everybody can use that. It's no problem. Most places, not all places.
That's right. Yeah, and it makes me think of a couple students, but a student I worked with who was in 3rd grade and he was considered a non-reader, okay? But if you read everything to him, he could comprehend on grade level. So everything was being read to him. So I met him, and then he started using an iPad, and on his iPad, he could take pictures of the posters on the wall in the school because he never could access that content. And so what he was doing is running around taking pictures of every single text he could use that text to speech. And what he said was, oh my gosh, I never thought I'd be able to read what my friends were reading. And that just made me want to weep, but I was so happy for him. But up until then, he was not an active participant in his learning. He was passive. He was just sitting decide, waiting for his friends to read everything to him and people taking notes for him. Or the time I worked with a student who had never read a chapter book and he was in 5th grade and he was considered the kid with all the behaviors. And so meeting him, we were sitting in the hallway, showing him how to use text to speech, and he read a whole chapter, the first chapter of this book on his own. And then I said, let me know what you just read. And for the first time as a 5th grader, he told me everything that he read. And he looked at me, he said, I did it. I did it. I did it. And we both cried. So the fact that, the technology, like we could be the barrier. If we're doing all these things for our student, it could be, we smell bad, right? Maybe it's that, or we're talking too fast, or we're the distraction. So again, I talked about earlier about, I thought being engaging was me doing hands-on, but stepping back and watching our kids. And then when they need us, we can facilitate, but giving them those tools that they need is really empowering for our learners.
I'm gonna have a really stiff neck at the end of this hour because I love you both so much, and everything you say, I go like this. So anyway, thank you so much. Brian, we talked when we were conceiving of this webinar, you know, I remember the tea I was drinking, and you were like, we've got to be talking about bounded autonomy because agency comes with this responsibility.
Yeah.
I'm gonna turn things to you.
Well, I'm hoping that my internet sticks and stays for a little bit and doesn't become as unstable as myself, as my emotional state. I want to talk about bounded autonomy because I think that oftentimes in education we're one or the other. We're gray, we're black or we're white, right? In the sense of, well, if we have to give students voice and choice, and that means everything. Like everything is voice and choice. And I got to be honest, it just doesn't work, right? And that's why we have that's why we have a bunch of Instagram posts and TikTok posts about teachers wanting to leave the profession because their students are out of control, or they don't feel like they're getting any support, or admin are just sending them back with a sucker, or whatever it is, right? Now those are slightly hyperbolic, but the idea is, well, what if we could break autonomy into a couple different areas and then say, what do we have control over? And then what do students need control over? And what can I give them? Now, the idea is that you still remain in a lot of that control, right? But you are starting to let go of some of one of these areas so that students can exercise their own autonomy in it. So those 5 areas, and we can talk about the nuances of those at a different time, but 5 major areas of that are task. And so that's the work being done. There's turf or space, right? The autonomy of the area in which I do that work, the technique over how I do that work, the time over how long it takes me to do that work, or how I manage my time, or my team, who helps contribute to the work to be done. And the important thing is the work to be done, and not just who's your friend, right? And I'm going to be honest with you, a lot of these, when you first start kind of letting go and releasing some of this and saying, look, I have to have control as the educator. I have to have control over the task, and I have to have control maybe over the technique this time, right? But I can give you some control over the team, and I can give you autonomy over your turf and space where it happens. When you first start that, and if you haven't done it before, it's going to feel a little awkward. And I'm going to be honest with you, your kids need to be able to have the right to fail at that, right? And they have to have the right to make mistakes in that so that we can talk about those things, right? And there are lots of ways to handle some of those, like if you have specific furniture, if you have like agile seating in your classroom, or you have, you have center set up or whatever that may be, you can take pictures of students using the space correctly, put it up, right? Put those pictures up. And so students know how to interact with that space or with those resources or whatever it may be. They know how to interact with it, or they can see visual prompts for that. But the idea is to really start sharing the power with students, right? Or with learners in your classroom. So if I can't control the task, like the task is the task, I don't even have control over it. We need to be working on, 2-digit division. That's just what it is, right? And I might not have too much, I might have to have control over the technique. We're going to use this method, right? We're going to still stick with PEMDAS, and we're going to figure out this algebraic equation, or whatever it may be, right? What can I give students for autonomy? And then the big question is, how does it contribute to the group, to the individuals around us, right? Our community, our learning community, and how does it contribute to the work that needs to be done? And what you will find, what I have found in my personal experience, is especially around team, because that's the one that everybody gets nervous about, but it's the one that we give the most autonomy over, right? Like, oh, find your partner, or find a group of people that are going to work on this. When we start to give real autonomy, what we start to see in real choices, and we scaffold in kind of that question of who contributes to the team and the work that needs to be done, as opposed to, do I just like hanging out with my friends? You start to see that students start making a definite choice because their expectancy of success goes up, right? They start to make definite choices for who can contribute skills for this particular task, right? And that's how I start to build my team. Or I know that I'm going to need a couple minutes more, or a day more, or our team's going to need some more. Do I have autonomy over the time that it takes me to do this and the time to turn it in? If it's a time test, I really don't. But I'm going to say honestly, like, what are the 2 big parameters around time? It's when it's assigned, when an assignment is assigned, and when ultimately grades are due. Like, those are the 2 like concrete brick walls of an assignment. Can't go any further than that, right? And but you can go right up into that. And so I think as we start to give students some of that autonomy, start to share that power and call it out that we're sharing that, right? And we're co-designing that, and we're building that together. Students start to they feel like they are contributing and they're building and they have ownership. And that's the beginning of that agency. You can go to the next one. So when we look at that, how do we scaffold them towards that choice or that bounded autonomy? We have towards making these stronger choices, these deeper choices. One of the things we have to do is we have to ask some of these questions. One of the 4 questions here. We need to help students consider autonomy. What do I control? Right? We kind of covered that. Value. What do I like? But also, what am I interested in? Notice that's not the only thing we're asking. Right? Because when we ask that, what are you interested in? That's, like, I'm interested in chairs, man. I'm interested in rocks. Well, this is an English class or this is a math class. It's going to be hard for us to work around that. So within parameters, what is it that I value? What needs do I have? And this is where it starts getting really deep into learner agency, them really being selfish or taking ownership of their learning and being selfish with their learning, holding it and really being reflective of their learning. I know people don't always like the term selfish with their learning, but being reflective of their learning, the needs, what skills do I need to work on, right? And what knowledge do I need to acquire to work on those skills? And is this an opportunity to work on that? Maybe it's not an opportunity to work on some of my skill gaps, but at least I'm thinking about the skill gaps that I may have. That's me looking at my own work, right? And going through the feedback, feed up, feed through kind of cycle, right? And saying, what do I need to acquire that? And then finally, what are the parameters? Well, if I don't have control over my time, how much time do I ultimately have? And what resources are available to me within this setting, this learning opportunity, this learning setting? And how do I share those resources so I don't create resource scarcity for others in my learning community? Right? Like I can't take all the blue markers, or I can't take all the time on our computers. I can't take up all of this. How do I begin to share that? Once we start asking students that and helping scaffold them through that and giving them some bounded autonomy, if you can go to the next slide, I believe.
Sorry, I was just reading the chat.
Yeah. Oh, okay. We'll come back to this, but we can leave it up. So once we start doing that, now students are starting to take over those pieces and they understand that we are sharing that. Now there are common pitfalls in honoring agency and choice. And we have to realize that for ourselves, and we have to help our learners realize that, right? One of the biggest ones, the other ones are kind of self-explanatory, but to me, one of the biggest ones on here is providing too many choices. And when we provide too many choices, we create the paradox of choice. And the paradox of choice, simply stated, is that with too many choices, we freeze up, right? And that's dependent on the student and the individual, and it's also dependent kind of on your community. And this is best seen in Las Vegas buffets. This is like, if a large buffet, this is the best that they see. In fact, they've run studies on them, right? And then what they see is that these large, all-encompassing buffets from every cuisine in the world, plus as many crab legs as you can eat, what they see is that people stick to kind of like one central area, because there's so many choices and there's so many new things to experience that we become nervous, right? Where did we see this with students? If you are an individual that is neurodivergent and you have ADHD, this is massive. This is task paralysis. This is decision paralysis, right?
Mm-hmm.
These are these pieces. And what happens is you have so much laid out in front of you and you want to explore them all, that you become paralyzed on where to start, right? The other ones obviously are excluding student voice and feedback. If you're not listening to the folks that are in your learning community, then how are you designing? You're not designing for them. You're designing what you want and making them conform to it. And then another common pitfall we do is we eliminate choices when things don't go as planned. And what I mean by this is we don't I know it seems paradoxical to the first one of providing too many choices, but it's not. It's in this case, we say, okay, everybody forget it then. We lock it down. We say, you're going to either do this or you're going to do that. There's no more agency in that, right? I get to choose yes or no, true or false. There's not agency that lies in that. So we become nervous as a designer instead of letting it kind of play out and innovating on the spot, we say, I'm going to reduce it all because this is too much, right? And then mistaking variety for choice. This is a big one. Like choice and options are they're deeper than just variety, right? Like you can listen to it or you can read it. Um, Part of that is variety, right? Like what tickles your fancy about it. But another part is how do you make larger choices? Like I need to work on this because I need to listen to this because, as Kelly stated, this is the first time I can really read what my students, what my colleagues, or what my peers are doing. Um, so we have to really kind of look at that, and it's a whole other topic of what are real options and real choice, and what is just variety of what we're doing. So variety is saying you can make a PowerPoint or a movie, right? Or you can write it as even better, you can write it as an essay, or you can write it as a story. Well, guess what? That's just variety in the same choice, right? You can make a cartoon, or you can draw it. You can make a video, or you can make a TikTok, right? Like all of those things are the same thing. It's just a change. It's just a variety on the same methodology. And then the other side of that is that we don't really coach our learners into making good choices. What we do is we assume that they're going to understand what those choices are, make a lot of assumptions. But it's also on to them to make those choices, right? And say, is this a real choice, or is this just you continuing with the same thing, right? And the idea is that while building this, what we share with our students, we are in control of as educators, right? So we still control the environment, the learning opportunities that exist there, and the learning environment so that it's safe and free of threats and distractions. We still control that, right? And we still push our students into learning agency. But as we're gradually releasing that, now students start making their own choices. And I have found that them starting to apply that in analytical thought to their choices actually makes them enjoy school a lot more. And now we have an engaged classroom, not just a ritually compliant classroom. Go ahead.
For those of you that are recognizing we're at the top of the hour, I want to just hop in and say thank you for being here. We are going to just kind of move all the way to the end because we are recording this, so you'll get the recording of the last little bit that we're going to wrap up here. But thank you. Before you go, I just want to say thank you for joining us. So, Brian.
Yes. Yeah. So here's some really great ways to kind of bring that in and design for apathetic learners, which is a term I don't really like, but designing for agency and learner variability. The first one is make connections, not just at the beginning of the year, but throughout the learning, right? And throughout the year. It's built into routines like the 2x10 routine or strategy, which if you haven't heard, there's a video there, but it's real simple. It's two students. You take two students, talk to them each for 2 minutes, 10 days. Right. And you really start to build a connection. And hopefully, if you really want it to be incredibly successful, you do it outside of the classroom where there's not really the same power dynamic. Right. So just two students, 10 days, 2 minutes each day. The other one is designing choices that learners can invest in. There's an art, like a blog that I wrote with another colleague around considering learner voice and what that means. There's creativity. How do we leverage the connections? And how do you leverage the connections you make to offer opportunities, checkpoints, frequent feedback? And feedback is not just you did well or you did wrong. It's also, it's not only where are you, it's also where are you going and how do we get there, right? Like that's the 3 levels of feedback, and giving pretty consistent checkpoints in on that feedback. Like how are you getting there? Right? Or what is the next step in where you want to go, right? And consistency. And this is class-wide approaches usually that are connected to goals and your learning culture, which you establish early in the year, and then you co-design with your students throughout. And it's always growing and always kind of expanding, right? But by checking with those 5 C's, kind of keeping those in your head, you begin to set choices and set a classroom that's built around agency and the variability of the individuals there.
I really appreciate this perspective because I know sometimes I'll hear teachers when I'm teaching about UDL and agency and choice, they're like, it's just too much, and I feel like I need to have a little bit more of a grounded approach. And what I'm hearing you describe is this way of designing for agency strategically and intentionally, but also holding on to, right? Learners getting to the goal, teachers feeling like they can be successful. So thank you for that. We want to just wrap up by saying, I don't know if any of you are old enough to remember when we had the commercials about orange juice, like it's not just for breakfast anymore. There was that whole phrase. Maybe nobody remembers that but me. But agency is not just for students. And this is not a workshop about the UDL implementation criteria, but it's a call out to it to say that CAS developed some criteria, almost like a very large rubric that says, what would UDL look like if it was used as if a school was designed using UDL as a lens? What if the school culture and the environment really thought about agency? What if the teaching and learning in the classroom really thought about agency? The leaders and the managers of the school, the policies and the practices thought about agency, and agency was assigned to professional learning. We might think differently about how we partner with families and caregivers. We might think differently about how we create learning environments. I love this image of a student who's using a wheelchair on a playground trying to get someplace, but there are steps, right? There are steps to get up, right? The design is the barrier to agency sometimes. We might think differently if we really honored agency and when we're developing policies and practices. Even policies like how we partner with families and caregivers in what we used to kind of call student teacher conferences. Do you have to have transportation? Do you have to be in person? Do you have to come on Tuesday between 2 and 4? Are there flexible ways we can honor your agency as a human being, earning a living, right? Being a parent. And finally, supporting professional learning. How might we honor the agency of teachers? I'm going to end you and just leave you with this quotation, and then we'll share a couple of resources with you. But the Mary Helen Immordino Yang, who some of you know, is a cognitive neuroscientist. She has a new piece through the Well Project, which I didn't know before I found it. And she says this: the center of the educational solar system, so to speak, is the experience of the people in the system thinking. What kinds of thinking happen in this community? What kinds of relationships are built around that thinking? What kinds of agency are afforded young people and their teachers to engage in meaningful thinking? And we'll just ask you, if you have time and you're still here, or if you're watching this as a recording, to do this on your own, just to reflect for a moment. What idea about learner agency do you want to remember? If you are in a place where you can put it in the chat, we'll have some collective learning and summarizing. And if you want to just think or share with people, or if you're still in that coffee shop, right, and you want to turn to that person and tell them what you want to remember about learner agency from what you saw in the chat, from something you heard here, or even just something that crossed your mind as you were listening, take a few moments and we'll give you time to do that.
It's really nice to see in the comments how everybody's been talking about agency and what it means to them, and then the things that they want to remember. And somebody made the point about us diving deeper into these slides, and I can tell you, I mean, we could run a 3-day easily, a 3-day on how to
Yes.
build agency and how to build choice and scaffold our learners into those choices and helping them kind of finding their own empowerment. And I do want to say something about empowerment. I think that oftentimes we say we want to empower students, and it's really us giving them little bits, right? I think about it sitting at a table, like I'm going to give you your plate of food, but you get to sit with the adults. That's not the same thing as true empowerment. True empowerment is I get to choose and eat as much as I need, right? And as much as I want, and I think that that's really what agency is. It's being able to sit at the table and make the choices about what I eat and how much of it I eat.
Well, if you really do want to be part of this cardigan party, we do want to hear from you. CAST has a great professional learning team, a great accessibility team, a research team, a communications team. What am I forgetting? A workforce team. So reach out to any and all of us, and we'd love to continue the conversation. We want to say thank you for joining us, and I'm going to stop sharing the slides here and just Kelly, any final words for us?
No, I'm just grateful for this time, just reading through the chat. I'm definitely saving the chat again. I just saved, I was like, oh my gosh, so many more wonderful things are going through there. And we're definitely better together. And I know from taking the time to be here, and everything that you're putting in the chat is highly valued. And I'm just so grateful for the work that everyone is doing.
Right. And remember, hashtag Cardi Parties on Thursday, Cardi Club.
My
Don't forget,
cardi's making
y'all.
me sweat.
I know. Well, I think it's actually the information. It's all the learning, right?
There you go.
That's what it is, because that learning's hot, right? So that's what's
Well
raising the
said.
tent. But
Mic
every
drop.
Thursday, every Thursday, Cardi Party now.
with
All right,
yours.
well, let's stay in the conversation, right? Figuring out what agency looks like.
Yep.
And thank you again.
Thank you, everyone.